Start. Good evening. My name is Nicholas Miller, and I'm a professor of law and religion at the Honors College at Washington Adventist University. And I'm joined tonight on the set of Fides et Politicas by Guilherme Brazil de Souza,
Hello,
who is
everyone.
glad to have you, Guilherme. He is completing his PhD studies at Princeton University, where he's been getting a PhD in relation to religious liberty and church-state relations in his native country of Brazil. And in a couple of months, will actually be returning to Brazil to take up a professorship himself at an Adventist university in Brazil. And we are happy to welcome him as one of the regular co-anchors, co-hosts, if you will, of Fides et Politicas. Welcome on board, Guilherme. What I'm going to do in the first few minutes of this discussion today is interview Guilherme about his studies at Princeton, what he's learned about church and state, and also his experiences in being a Brazilian, living at times in Brazil, and how their political situation compares and contrasts and can actually shed light on our American political situation. After that short interview for a few minutes, Guilherme will ask me, as he's a co-host, not just a special guest, we're going to discuss some of the current events happening in California, the protests in Los Angeles, some of which have spilled over into some violence, National Guard, and then actual military troops being called to the streets of LA, where I used to work as a lawyer. And it raises questions about the use of the military in the United States. There's a statute which would appear to prevent that. The invocation of emergency powers by the president, and how this all fits under our constitutional system. And if we have time, we may talk about a couple of Supreme Court decisions. So we've got quite an agenda, but we intend to do this at least once a week in the upcoming months. So there'll be more time to talk about these things. But Guilherme, thank you so much for joining us, for partnering with us in this program. Maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and what led you to do the studies that you've undertaken at Princeton.
First of all, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on this platform, and I really look forward to co-hosting with Nick and also being able to share a little bit more about our joint passion about religious freedom. I'm originally from Brazil, but I grew up most of my life between both of the countries. And I think when you grow up between two countries, almost half of your life in one and half on the other, you really start to compare, right, and contrast how those experiences were. And something that led me kind of on the path towards studying church-state relations, religious liberty, and where I was currently at Princeton Seminary, it was my own experience growing up in Brazil as a Seventh-day Adventist in a predominantly Roman Catholic country. So just not to belabor us too long, because I know you have a lot to discuss, but when I was around 17, the country of Brazil, I had a national exam. Well, it still has this national exam, which is like the equivalent of the ACT. And the Seventh-day Adventists and other Sabbatarian Christians and Jews, they were denied in 2009 a religious accommodation. So that created an entire system of mass mobilization by the Religious Liberty Department of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. For those who might not know, it's an institution that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has that's dedicated exclusively to advocating for religious freedom for all. They filed the motion to the Brazilian Supreme Court, and what they managed to get was basically a compromise. So the accommodation that they got was to lock us up on Saturday morning in the public school classroom with only water, and we would have to stay there for like 12 hours waiting to take the exam. So which depending on the time zone that you were in, like my cousin who's a doctor now who studied medicine, which is a very competitive field, you would start the exam at around 9 p.m. because it was during the summer, right? So that was kind of my brief contact and with religious freedom kind of firsthand. And I think something that kind of motivated me a lot to pursue this path of advocating for religious freedom, of studying religious freedom, was actually reading your dissertation, Nick, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment, published by Oxford University Press. I think it actually was very kind of a paradigm shift for me when I read that book, because it just showed kind of the roots of my own faith tradition as a Seventh-day Adventist, and the commitment that this faith tradition had with advocating for religious freedom and church-state separation as we understand it. So that was, and when I came here back to the States, I did college. I went to a school, Southern Adventist University, for those who are Adventists. I know that very well, that school. Then I went on to do my master's in church history, where I studied at Yale Divinity School, where I studied, I wrote on Sunday laws in the U.S., and now I'm currently doing my PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary. Now back in Brazil, and talking about how religious minorities like Seventh-day Adventists have contributed to a more robust understanding of religious freedom in Brazil in the present.
So I appreciate that very nice and spontaneous product placement for my dissertation in the book, The Religious Roots of the First Amendment. I didn't ask him to do that, so that's very gratifying. But let me ask you about your dissertation. I know you're not quite finished with it yet, but what is it that you're studying and writing on currently that you're trying to find out about religious liberty? And I think it relates to Brazil, doesn't it? Tell me about it.
It does. So my dissertation, it kind of builds on a lot of, well, my own experience living that I just mentioned in Brazil as a Seventh-day Adventist. And I really wanted to show how religious minorities have contributed to making Brazil a more free society. And Brazil obviously has a social democratic constitution that has borrowed from the First Amendment guarantees of religious liberty and church-state separation from the U.S. Constitution. But it's one thing for you to impose a constitution, many times a constitution that derives from another culture. It's another thing for you to make that effective in society. So in my dissertation, I talk a little bit about how religious liberty developed in Brazil. I talk about some of the challenges that Brazil has faced in applying the liberal guarantees of religious liberty and church-state separation in the U.S. That we have here in the U.S. in their context, in light of a lot of the culture and the political factors, being, as you know, like I mentioned, a very conservative, historically Catholic country. More recently, also have like a strong influence of like Marxism and socialism. And then I talk about how two minorities. I talk about Seventh-day Adventist minorities, and also I looked at. I'm from Bahia, the northeast of Brazil, which is the largest community of persons of African descent outside of Africa. So I talk about how Afro-Brazilian religious minorities have also contributed to a more robust understanding of religious freedom. So I kind of defend the thesis that in the case of Seventh-day Adventists, they help us understand religious freedom better in Brazil by making or challenging the Brazilian Supreme Court, the Brazilian legal system, to embrace a more individual rights framework. And we can talk more a little bit about that understanding of religious freedom. And also in the case of Afro-Brazilian religious minorities, bring the conversation of race and religious freedom discussions, right? So many times religious freedom is seen merely as an individual abstract right, but I think I try to argue that the experiences of these African religious minorities, it also shows us the importance of also considering questions of race, of racism in conversations of religious freedom.
And in fact, the idea of group or community rights
exactly
is something I should mention that Guilherme and I worked on a project last summer that took us to Brazil. Both he and I have done some work with the Interfaith Forum of the G20 Economic Group. Most people have heard of the G20, the largest 20 economies in the world. They meet every year at different places. And we work with a engagement group that tries to get religious people and sensitivities as part of the policymaking process. And we spent some time, Guilherme was my guide and translator in Brazil, and we talked about these Afro-Brazilian groups and the importance of learning how to balance both individual religious freedom with group rights and the heritage of some of these Afro-Brazilian groups and their need to be protected from the larger majoritarian community. And in my time in Brazil, I became quite fascinated how Brazilian politics mirrors, in some ways, American politics. And here in America, we become aware that our politics have become more polarized over time. The left side, the Democratic side, has become more and more left-wing, and the right side seems to be becoming more and more right-wing and Christian nationalism. And in some ways, that is where South America in general and Brazil in particular has a history. You talked about socialism and Marxism being on the left, right? We don't really have any true, at least Marxist in American democratic politics, right? I mean, that's further left than most of the Democratic Party would be. But there's also a strong Catholic Christian nationalism heritage in Brazil, which is even perhaps further right than we've experienced in the United States. So we're becoming more like South America and more like Brazil. And right now, as I understand it, in Brazilian politics, you have a kind of left-wing, semi-socialist government, but they just took over from a president and an administration that was more right-wing. Tell us a little bit about the former president Bolsonaro and how he echoed and was a bit of a similar leader that Donald Trump was in relation to religion and populism.
Yeah, so Jair Bolsonaro, he was the former president of Brazil before Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Brazil's current president, who's now on his third term, I think. And Bolsonaro, it's a very interesting phenomenon, especially for kind of U.S. scholars, Brazilianists, people that are kind of interested in those transnational connections. Obviously, because of his ties with our current president here, with Donald Trump, and also because of some of the ideas and some of the figureheads that are behind, not merely behind Bolsonaro, but the Bolsonaro phenomenon, right? So Bolsonaro, he has a military background. He's one of the few presidents since Brazil re-democratized in 1988 with the Constitution of 1988. So Bolsonaro, he's very unique in that he has a very militarized discourse. He's also very unique because of the Trump rhetoric, and because of the connections between not only his friendship but also some of the ideas. Trump obviously was very close to Steve Bannon. Bolsonaro was very close to a philosopher, a very nationalist right-wing philosopher called Olavo de Carvalho, who was also friends with Steve Bannon. There's actually a book, if we can, I don't know how we do a little bit more merchandise, but plugging in Benjamin Teitelbaum's War for Eternity. He talked about some of the transnational connections between Steve Bannon, Olavo de Carvalho, who was Bolsonaro, who was the kind of the intellectual figurehead behind Bolsonaro, and also Alexander Dugin in Russia. And kind of the thesis that they have is a rejection of kind of the liberal world as constructed post World War II, and they call for what they identify as a multipolar world, which is basically kind of a nice word for nationalism. So it's a very kind of this Heideggerian notion that each nation has their own design, and we can get maybe more on that if you're interested.
Yeah, and just to drop in here, that the nationalism you speak to isn't just purely a kind of civic love of country or patriotism, we might call it, but it always seems to come wrapped up in some kind of religious identity, right? But the figures you talked about all would connect with Christian nationalism to some degree or another. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Like Olavo de Carvalho, he's a Catholic. Very conservative Catholic, very influenced by the Catholic counter-revolutionary tradition of Joseph de Maistre, Donoso Cortés, Carl Schmitt, most recently, for those of you who kind of studied totalitarianism. Even though he does kind of deny his association with Carl Schmitt for obvious reasons. But you do see he is, I would say, in continuity with a right-wing Catholic tradition in Brazil, and I can also talk more about that if you want to. That is very close to what you have in France with a guy called Charles Maurras, right, who was the anti-Dreyfusard in the Dreyfus case. But anyway, to go back to kind of your point,
but also in Russia, the Dugin that you mentioned brings the same Christian Catholic. Well, it's not Catholic nationalism.
Eastern,
it's
Greek Catholic.
Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah.
But the point that I'm, some of our listeners will know the names you've mentioned. Many of them won't. But the thing they should understand is that that they've probably heard the phrase Christian nationalism in relation to American right-wing politics. But it's clear that this isn't just an American phenomenon, that there's actually a broader worldwide tradition of bringing church and state together that has its roots in a kind of medieval construct and outlook. Some Catholic thinkers are referred to as integralists. And the names you've mentioned, many people won't know most of them or any of them, but almost all our listeners will have heard of J.D. Vance.
Exactly.
J.D. Vance is the Vice President of the United States. J.D. Vance also happens to be a Catholic who is, and there's different versions of Catholics on Catholicism, but he has been hanging around and supportive of ideas of Catholic integralism, which go along with the names that you've just mentioned. Am I right?
Oh, no, that's absolutely correct. And maybe just to clarify a little bit, integralism, it was kind of it still is the socio-political doctrine of the Catholic Church. Vatican II, and obviously I know there's going to be debate here, and some of my Catholic friends might disagree, but it made a sort of reconciliation with liberalism as a hypothesis. But the thesis, or kind of the dogma, is Catholic integralism that derives from Thomism, which is this corporatist organization of society, this union of throne and altar. So we see that in the Catholic circle, but in the Protestant circle, and you might find this interesting as well, that also turns Bolsonaro into a very unique, that was a very unique moment in Brazil history, because he's managed to aggregate evangelicals and Catholics, right? So he's a very unique political figure, because those groups they tended historically to be very separate. So he managed also, and we could also argue on the cause of that as well, with some of the policies that the left-wing parties enacted, that kind of similar to what happened in the US in the 70s, right, with the moral majority, kind of brought these two groups together. So he's become a sort of some scholars of religion, they refer to Bolsonaro in Brazil as a Christian candidate, not merely a Catholic or a evangelical, because even though he's Catholic, his wife is evangelical, and he was elected by a very strong evangelical coalition that was influenced by another phenomenon now in the Protestant world, which is very similar to the integralism that we just mentioned, which is called Protestant theonomy. And if you have questions, I can tell you more of how that got to Brazil.
Let me just drop in there that in the past, we've talked about this podcast. Our subtitle here is Faith and Public Policy. So we don't want to be hypocrites in pointing the finger at other Christians who want to bring faith and public policy together, because we actually think that can be a good thing. Yeah. But this podcast and the institutions that we're connected with are in what I've termed in the past the free church tradition. Within Protestantism, there are strands of Protestantism that are supportive of a version of integralism, like Reformed thought, and sometimes called Calvinist thought. Calvin's Geneva was a kind of integral government where church and state worked closely together, and the state enforced many of the spiritual dogmas of the church. So we can't just say it's Protestantism versus Catholicism. No, there's a particular strand of Protestantism, the Anabaptists, that moves into the Baptists and then the Methodists, the free church tradition. And I like that better than some kind of reference to dissenting Protestantism, because we have to recognize that there are members of other churches, including Catholics, especially post-Vatican II Catholics.
John Corny Murray.
John Courtney Murray, who's written in a sense in the Free Church tradition, and it should be even broader than that, because of course we have Jewish friends who write in the call it the Free Synagogue tradition, and there are Muslims who actually write in this way. So we call it the Free Church tradition because we're part of the Christian tradition. But we're going to talk about these issues and critique them, if you will, not from a belief that the public square should only be secular, but that the moral convictions brought to bear by Christians should be supportable by not just biblical teaching, but also by natural law. And we'll talk more about the first four commandments versus the second six commandments and how the second six reflect the natural law and so on and so forth. But anyway, you can see that there's a rich conversation here. And by bringing in Guilherme, who has these international perspectives, we're wanting to take this podcast so that we can speak meaningfully and sensitively, not just to the United States church-state situation, but the larger one in the Americas more generally and even overseas. So we're so pleased to have Guilherme on. There's a lot we can unpack in what we've just gone over, but I think we've given you an introduction to the kinds of experiences that he's had, and that, combined with those that I've had being an historian, especially of American church-state relations, as well as a practicing attorney in that area. There's going to be two or three other people that we'll bring in as regular hosts as well. And so we're looking for a very rich dialogue that we think will contribute both to our church and the larger Christian world and religious world in discussing these issues. But we were going to give Guilherme a chance to do some hosting today himself. And so maybe we'll shift gears at this point and talk a bit about latest current events in Los Angeles, emergency powers, and maybe even the Supreme Court. So why don't you give us a little introduction for that?
No, fantastic. So as we kind of shift, I think this is going to be kind of the usual format that we have for those of you who are watching us for the first time. And we also want to talk about some of the current events. And one of the current events that is really kind of rocking the nation, the U.S. Right now, and is becoming a matter of social commentary, has been the recent developments in Los Angeles, California. Depending on what side of the political aisle, some are the narrative of riots, of protests. And we really wanted to give a very balanced, nuanced take on this conversation. And we wanted to ask you, Dr. Nick, with your legal analysis, maybe just to tell us a little bit. We all know that these events, they happen as a result of a reaction or response to some of the ICE raids that were happening. And maybe we can begin there. Like, how constitutional are these movements, and what can we say about the reaction to them, and now the counter reaction to them, which is now bringing or considering bringing the Marines and interfering in California's what California would allege to be its state sovereignty. So let's begin. Maybe just giving our listeners a little bit of the context behind, because we probably do have people that are watching us from overseas. What's going on in LA right now?
So I'm from Southern California and used to practice law in downtown LA. So the streets there are familiar to me, and I've watched with growing levels of concern and deep concern the protests, which are now spilling over into at times violence. Fortunately, at this point, it seems only against property, though some protesters have been shot with rubber bullets, and there's been some violence, if you will, both directions. But this is taking place in a larger context that I think our listeners should understand. In America, there's ever since after the Civil War, a few years after the Civil War, a statute was passed called Posse Comitatus, the Posse Comitatus Act, which really means that U.S. military troops, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, that it is against the law to use military troops in general law enforcement activities, right? That you need to rely on local police. There's something else called the National Guard. The National Guard isn't federal military, it's actually state level um, um, troops that each state can have that cooperates with the federal government, but is actually run by the governor of the state. And so the context, so ICE comes, and I think we have to see a certain level of intentional provocation here,
Mm.
right? The first pictures to emerge, we usually think of ICE agents as being plain clothes, perhaps coming in a black car, showing their badges. And it's an attempt to not be overly intrusive or disruptive of the civilian population, right? You target certain places where you have information about undocumented migrants. But for some reason, this time the ICE agents dressed up really as military personnel, carrying long guns in camouflaged uniforms, and descended on some restaurants and areas in Los Angeles in a very kind of intrusive and disruptive way, where there are high numbers of immigrants and foreigners. Los Angeles is a very, huge numbers, percentages of minorities, and certain level of undocumented. And if you're not undocumented, people who are typically if you're in that community. And so it was very disturbing, frightening to have this kind of what appeared to be military action on the streets, even though technically that probably wasn't unconstitutional, because as I understand it, they were ICE agents, not military personnel.
That would be
But
constitutional then for the government, for the national government to deploy ICE.
to deploy ICE is constitutional, but not everything that's constitutional is wise, right?
Right, exactly.
That it's illegal to deploy troops generally to keep to enforce laws on the streets. So here you go creating people that look like troops, and you send them in almost a military engagement fashion. And people must have known it was bound to be a provocation, and it caused a reaction by the civilians in the town there. And then that reaction, it was felt justified, not only calling out the police to support ICE, to keep the peace, but even some National Guard units. And then the latest is because some vehicles have been burned and rocks thrown. So President Trump is now saying he's bringing in Marines to
Yeah,
keep
what talk
order in
about
the streets of LA.
talk about the constitutionality of that and presidential powers. What can the president do that? Can he be deploying in light of the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878?
Well, so if you go and you read the act, you'll discover that there are some exceptions to it. That, like, if the Constitution allows for it, and if Congress passes legislation allowing for it, you can use troops. Now, there doesn't seem to be an actual invasion or rebellion or insurrection in California, right? It's a few dozen people throwing rocks, not a coordinated group attempting to overthrow the government. But nevertheless, the president is invoking emergency powers because of the civil war, the rebellion that is occurring in California, which is much like the invasion. So there's kind of a
Right.
history that the president has undertaken here in removing some immigrants from our country. He invoked the Enemy Aliens Act, Invasion Act from the 1800s, that basically said if a country is invading, that you can hold their aliens over the age of 14 and deport them with minimal due process. And no court at this point has affirmatively ruled that I know of that, in fact, an invasion is happening. He tried to argue that Venezuelan gangs were coming in an organized way. But I mean, this is to give new definition to the word invasion. So this, and in fact, I know the governor of California has challenged in court the bringing in of the Marines. And I'm assuming we'll make arguments relating to the Posse Comitatus Act as well as probably other acts. saying that this is illegal and unconstitutional. And probably the courts will agree with the governor of California, right? Given the low levels of violence, and there's just not a coordinated rebellion taking place. There's a few rioters and anarchists that are taking advantage of the protests there. And words matter. You mentioned earlier the difference between violent actions and then protesters.
Mm.
A lot of Americans think that, well, protesters are just individuals who are looking to commit violence, one just sweeps into the other. But I'd like to remind my friends that nonviolent protest is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution.
No, for
Right? The
sure.
First Amendment to the Constitution says we have the right to peacefully assemble, to seek for a redress of our grievances. Protest is a very profound part of a democratic government, so profound and important that we protect it along with religion and speech and the press in our very First Amendment. And Christians, I believe, should be willing to protest. This is part of your duties as a citizen. And if we look for biblical roots of this, Christ's marching into Jerusalem with on the donkey was a form of protest. Going into the temple and throwing out the money changers is a significant form of protest. So I think that we have a biblical basis that when the government is intruding on basic civil liberties and civil rights, the things that we have because we are in the image of God are sacred things, right? Christ was protecting and protesting sacred things in the temple. But you know what he also said was a temple? It was going to, remember what he said about he would tear down the temple and raise it in 3 days?
Yeah.
What was that temple? It was the temple of his body.
Body.
And in a sense, we're all made in the image of God. There's a certain sacredness to the human temple. And I believe that when that sacredness is being infringed, is being arbitrarily used and misused and abused, that Christians would have an appropriate role in peacefully, respectfully, but assertively and affirmatively protesting that. Now, that's different than violent protest, which goes beyond those limits, right?
No, that's fantastic. And on that note, what's your prediction if things continue the way they are? How do you think the best way would be to de-escalate the situation? And what can Christians, and since you're people of faith that do have this indignation, protest in a positive way versus a negative violent way?
Well, that's why I think it's so important for Christians to be involved with this, right? It's so easy as Christians to say, "Oh, we're gonna, keep our righteousness and let that burn, and we'll stay over here and stay in our churches and sing our songs and say our prayers." But I can tell you that, that if the Christians aren't there, the anarchists will be, right? Most of these groups aren't filled with anarchists. They're just people like you and I who care about their neighbors, and they want to protest on behalf of injustices. But these groups get infiltrated by some anarchists, by some people who are willing to use violence. And insofar as Christians stay away, the salt and the light isn't there, right? The reason the civil rights movement of the 60s and early 70s were so successful is because there was significant Christian leadership and presence. And that significant Christian leadership and presence kept things calm, kept the peace, kept the protests away from violence, because that's just what the other side wants. The other side wants the violence. In fact, they're in some ways, I believe, trying to provoke it so that they can justify their own violent reaction in response and justify taking away the civil liberties of various groups. So as Christians, as Christian leaders, as Christian members, insofar as we can be there to counteract the influence of the anarchists and those who are going to be violent, and infuse the salt and the light to keep these things respectful and peaceful, then that will demonstrate as to who's actually causing or provoking the violence or bringing the violence, right? We have a Christian duty protest, but protest peacefully and with dignity and respect.
Yeah, when I was sorry, this is not a little off topic, but it's kind of related because in New Haven, I think there was one protest I witnessed. Um, it was 2019 during that whole kind of era, the whole conversation on police brutality.
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter. Yeah, it was right before. It was like right before the George Floyd moment. It was actually a young lady was shot where I used to live in Dixwell Avenue in New Haven, and I saw a lot of the. Like, I followed it through. I was watching a lot of it, and when I noticed that there's a lot of churches, like people that are churches that are faithful Christians, they're at the protest. But then I noticed that sometimes the protest it can kind of get hijacked by these other subversive elements that are putting in these other issues and platforms that the Christians or the people of faith, not just Christians, but you have also atheists who are in favor of justice and all of that. But you get the point. That would not necessarily subscribe to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you hijacking a legitimate concern, a legitimate movement for these other purposes.
Yeah, well, I think so. I think Christians should not only attend these protests, I think Christian leaders should be involved in helping organize them, right? So that they can help set down the parameters and the proper training to avoid violence. And I think we should also, Christians often have choirs and musical capacities and resources. Like, Jehoshaphat marched into war with a choir. I know other religious groups, the Mennonites and some others bring a choir to the protest, right? That's going to keep the right kind of mood rather than the violent mood that some want to inject into it. So I think that there's a lot, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If Christians stay away from this kind of thing and then say, oh, look, it's becoming violent. Well, part of the reason it's becoming violent, perhaps, is because Christians aren't playing the salt and light role that they should be playing.
Like, where are the peacemakers, right?
The peacemakers. That's right. That's right.
Well, Nick, there's also another, aside from the situation in Los Angeles this past weekend, and that's ongoing, and I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to comment on it depending on how things develop. There's also been a recent case that the Supreme Court ruled, Oklahoma statewide charter school board versus Drummond. This just came out recently, a couple of days ago, and we wanted to hear a little bit of your legal analysis about. It was a 4-4. One of the justices recused herself, Amy Coney Barrett, and we wanted to know a little bit of your analysis. How significant is this case for church-state relations and for kind of the precedent and the case law that's been building with SCOTUS throughout the years?
Yeah, this is kind of a rare win for the Establishment Clause, right? More and more over the last few years, the Free Exercise Clause has been given robust interpretation, but the Establishment Clause, which is the thing that helps keep the separation of church and state, has been chipped away at. And this is a rare case where, so this was a charter school is a kind of public school, or it's a school that gets public funding to operate perhaps with a special focus. Like somebody may want to start a charter school that focuses on the environment, environmental issues, and students are going to get special extra classes in taking care of being stewards of the physical world. Well, usually you can't be a religious school and do this because it's a publicly funded school. So it's meant to be open and supportive of everyone, religious or non-religious. But in Oklahoma, a Catholic school decided it wanted to argue that not giving funding to the religious schools was a form of discrimination. And so they brought this case saying that this Catholic school should get this public school funding, which is not indirect funding or voucher funding, which the court has allowed, but is just direct funding from the state paying for the whole school. And so it was a very close case, 4-4. As you mentioned, Amy Coney Barrett, who's a Catholic herself, and maybe turning out to be a little bit more moderate than many people had thought when she was first chosen, She, ironically, there's an irony to this story. She was friends with some of the leadership of this Catholic school, so she felt that she had to recuse herself from it. She would have been the fifth vote to, allow for the funds to go there, but because she recused herself, it ended up being 4-4. And when it's 4-4, it means the lower court decision stands, which in this instance was the Supreme Court of Oklahoma, who had said that the funding did violate the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment. So for now, states cannot just directly fund religious schools, which I think is the better understanding of the First Amendment. If you go back to James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, there was a dispute in Virginia over the funding of schools run by different churches and denominations. And both of them said, no, this shouldn't be allowed. State funds shouldn't be going directly to private religious schools. So I think the Establishment Clause has been upheld and vindicated in this particular decision, and I think we can be supportive of it.
Well, that's great. And I had a kind of a question for you. A lot of my more conservative friends, they bring up kind of the question of, churches have this vital role in society as mediating institutions, providing social services, and kind of picking up where the government has kind of left off. What do we say? Like, what would you say to that kind of concern that even, might sound like a valid concern, that why is it so important for money not to be dispersed to religious organizations? Why is that such a big violation of the Establishment Clause?
Well, because it's forcing other people to pay for your religious beliefs and for the spreading of those religious beliefs, right? There's something, our finer Jefferson thought there was something fundamentally incorrect about that. But more to the point, if you're really wanting religion to be successful, then you really need to have it be dependent and responsive to the people that are actually members of it rather than the government. Because if the government is providing it funding, and I want to make a distinction here between direct and indirect funding, right? I'm actually supportive of voucher systems that would allow private individuals to send their tax money to a religious school if they want an alternative to a public school, because that's still the private choice of the individual, and those schools still need to respond to the religious concerns of those persons. But when you get direct funding, it's just the government decides we want to support this religion and that religion. It does two things. It discriminates against the minority religions, but it also makes whatever religions receive the funding more dependent on and responsive to the government rather than to the changing needs of the people. So if you want to find a place where government support religion, you can go to Europe, you can go to Canada. Like, those countries still have often state churches. They have funds that go to support ministers. The Scandinavian countries, you've heard of the Anglican Church, or Church of England. But all of these countries, the churches are like these official institutions that have very little and hardly any per popular support. Like 5% of the country goes to church in England on a Sunday, whereas it's, closer to 50% in the United States. So history and our experience shows that when government supports religion directly, it tends to wither and die and take away the private entrepreneurial principle that keeps religion fresh and positive and keeps people supporting it in ways that make it relevant to society.
Now, that reminds me of I think James Madison's letter to Edward Livingston. He says we're teaching the world the great lesson that religion flourishes in greater purity without than with the aid of civil government, right? And I think it's interesting how you mentioned that, because even those countries, like, if we compare Europe, you don't have such a vibrant religious market like we have
in the United States,
even in Brazil, right, where you have like church-state separation.
Yeah.
We don't have that, and I think it's really that free market of religions that allows those services to multiply, as opposed to having one kind of or one groups of churches getting these special privileges at the expense of the rest. And I kind of just have one question also on that. Are there any implications of this for what's kind of going currently on with the current administration's policies on nonprofits? What we've seen in this past year with the crackdowns on USAID, are there any implications for that, or are these very distinct and separate matters?
Yeah, so the USAID does fund what sometimes are considered to be technically religious organizations. One is our own Adventist Development and Relief Agency, but they can only receive that funding if, in fact, they don't discriminate in the use of services, if they are not pervasively religious organizations, right? You can't be a church. So the Adventist Development and Relief Agency is a separate organization, as is Catholic Charities, and none of the funds that are used can be used for confessional religious purposes, right? These all have to be for purposes that the government has approved, and disaster relief and famine relief and healthcare relief and so on and so forth. So those are interesting cases that come near the edge of church-state separation violation. But I think generally, it's unfair if religious people are willing to carry out a service that secular people can also get funded for to carry out that same service. And they can do it, and the religious people will do it in that same secular way. Then is it a kind of discrimination against them because you're just not allowing them to do it because they happen to be religious? So
Right.
that it illustrates the tension or the balance between the free exercise and the establishment clauses.
Do you see them as complementary, or do you see them as having tensions? That's a question I asked our kind of mutual friend, Richard Fulton.
Yeah, well, I think it's both. I mean, I prefer to view them most of the time as complementary, but you have to see that at times, stopping, well, for instance, this case that we think was good, that this Catholic charter school, if it was any other kind of school, could get this funding. It is a little bit of a restraint on their free exercise of religion, but I think it is justified by Establishment Clause principles. And so we kind of live with a little bit of tension at times between those two clauses. They're not completely contradicting each other, and there is a kind of complementary role, but I do think at the margins there can be certainly some tensions between the two.
Well, fantastic. I think we've touched on some really important topics for this week. This is our inaugural podcast, so please stay tuned if you really appreciate this content. Do not forget to like and subscribe. This will be one of many, and we really hope to get out the word and educate more people about this free church tradition. And we'll have a lot more legal analyses with Nick, and also with our new guest that will be coming on soon. And I'm going to pass on the word to Nick for any concluding remarks or any information that we would like to leave with you before we end the stream.
Yes, it's great to have Guilherme on board. We'll also have Dr. Jonathan Scriven, who's my colleague at the Honors College, as well as 2 or 3 other individuals. And we want to more regularly, hopefully on a weekly basis, bring this free church tradition to today, right? How does this free church tradition inform us in this cacophony of voices, Catholic, evangelical, Christian nationalist, secular? We think that there's a profound and long-standing tradition that has been developed over several centuries, coming from profound Protestant thinkers, that can help give us guidance as we navigate these difficult and challenging times. So thank you for joining us. We say good night to you, good night to Guilherme, and we'll connect again in another week or so.
All righty. Bye-bye. And again, don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye-bye.